And for him to die in that place was meant to be. And so all of a sudden I started to be like, yeah, right? It comforted me to know that he died for a purpose. So after that, it was important for me to help instill in my little brother that we all have a purpose. We all have the purpose after we leave tonight. We all have a purpose to go out there. Each one of these moments, the hate rhetoric that comes up, these are opportunities for us to be our greatest. Those are my brothers and sisters that are wearing turbans, wearing hijabs, wearing an article of faith, that are openly out there. And everybody, right? These are opportunities that you need to impart education, impart loving, and just impart inclusive communities. So that was important for me to get through to him, and that the worst of the times is our time to shine.
So there's so much to your story in the fact that these two met right after Pardeep's father was killed in the attack on the Sikh temple. And I know when people hear Arno and see him in the film, there's so many questions. How could you turn? How did that happen? And I wish we had time, because I've heard him talk so many times about his transformation. I know he's going to talk a little bit about it tonight, but we don't really have time to delve into it. I do want to ask him about something that we've spoken about before, which I think is so vital for us to understand now. And in this transition, about this notion of practice. And so can you talk about what you practiced before and what you're practicing now?
Thank you, Patrice. Practice is something that I think about daily, and it's something that we work with on a regular basis in Serve to Unite. Practice is, in its simplest form, it's becoming familiar with something. So if you practice a sport, the more you practice, the more familiar you are with the moves and the rules in the game of that sport. The same goes for music. Quite often, though, as human beings, we don't realize that we may be practicing other things, things that we do daily. We don't see them as practices, and we don't understand the ongoing effect that familiarity with whatever that thing is that we're repeating has on our life and on the world around us. As a young child, I grew up in a fairly well-to-do household, nice neighborhood, nice house, never went hungry, never took a beating. But my father was an alcoholic and put a lot of pressure on my mom to keep that household going. They fought a lot. My mother would be crying often from them fighting, and my mother's misery made me miserable as a young child, and I started lashing out at other kids. Hurt people, which is something that we contemplate often and keep in mind, that when people are lashing out, they're doing it because they're suffering. So as I lashed out in an unhealthy process of my own suffering, I started to get a kick out of the chaos that it caused. And as I grew older and I had stimulation from lashing out, like any other form of substance abuse, what got me off the first time, what was a kick the first time, 10 times later is just old hat. So I had to keep escalating my antisocial behavior until when I was a teenager, I was very familiar with violence. I was familiar with lashing out at society. Essentially, I had been practicing lashing out and hurting people and being angry and hateful for 16 years by the time I was introduced to the white supremacist movement. And I was introduced through music, which was another practice. I could listen to music that reinforced the white supremacist narrative on a daily basis. So as a white supremacist, I practiced hate and violence. When you're familiar with hate and violence, things like love and compassion and all the really beautiful aspects of being a human being are unfamiliar to you. They're not only unfamiliar, but they're repulsive to you. You don't understand kindness. It makes you very uncomfortable because you're not familiar with it whatsoever. You're familiar with violence. That's your natural state. And in the wake of August 5th, before I had even met Pardeep, I was in the process of developing a workshop to go through with young people, exploring the nature of practice. Namely, to answer the question as to why somebody would do this. Why would someone walk into a place of worship on a beautiful August Sunday morning with a loaded gun and just start killing people? Because this man had practiced hate and violence for well over a decade of his life. And it brought him to a point where all the normalcy of everyone else's everyday life was gone. His relationships had all deteriorated. He was in his middle 40s and he had no career. Everything was going wrong in his life. And because of his practice of hate and violence, which also involves fear, it also involves ignorance, it also involves blame, when things are going wrong, he blames everyone else instead of taking responsibility himself, and things get progressively worse. And this is what led this man to a point where he was so miserable that nothing seemed to make sense but homicide followed by suicide. Now, the workshop that and we still do this workshop, to answer the questions of how could someone do this, more importantly, we answer the question of what can we do about it as a society, as individuals. And the answer to that is also practice. And I know this from experience. I was able to change my life around because very brave people who I claim to hate, people who had brown skin, people who were Jewish, people who had sexual orientations that weren't mainstream, had the bravery to treat me with kindness when I least deserved it. Now, it's very easy to be nice to nice people. It's very difficult to be nice to people who don't deserve it. But they're the people who need that kindness the most. So how can we get to a point where our kindness is so powerful and our kindness is so impactful that we can give it to people who don't deserve it, don't seem to deserve it? We practice. So when we practice kindness and we make this part of our daily routine and we make it something that we're familiar with, as we go about our daily lives, we are an ongoing antidote to hate and violence. The root of all violence is suffering in one way or another, and it's isolation, and the suffering and isolation tends to feed itself. I genuinely believe that the right act of kindness at the right time could have diverted Wade Page from his end and the tragic end of 6 other lives on August 5th, 2012. Wade Page being gone, we don't know who the next suffering, isolated person out there on the verge of hurting themselves and hurting other people is. Which is why it's all the more important that we practice kindness as broadly and as unconditionally as possible and create an environment that's less conducive to hate and violence.
And I think it's also about the practice that we have in our communities. I think there's these discussions and people say, oh, look, the only way to deal with hate is just to educate the children. Well, the children see us, right? They go home, they see us, they meet us. It's about our whole, the totality of all of us, our community, and how we interact with each other. And I want to talk to Navjeet and ask him not just questions about his experience first, but also why is it that you feel so compelled to be involved in Bridges program, and why you think it's an important sort of group to be convening now?
Actually, Bridges was convened shortly after 9/11, and thanks to a professor at Northeastern University, they originally had some funding, and the basic idea was that there needed to be a table at which community and law enforcement agencies could engage. And I think we've sort of carried it forth since then. There was a little bit of a tendency early on to declare victory in a way, to say, no, there's no problem, we've solved everything. But I think some of the community members kept pushing to some extent and made sure we continually engaged law enforcement agencies. We used to meet every month. So that's as far as bridges, but let me kind of step back and also talk about why kind of I even came there in the first place. I think there's sometimes when you are a little different, when you're a minority in particular, or you're immigrants, it's very easy to try to be with the familiar, to try to not deal with the unfamiliar. And I think you have to make a little special effort. And one of the things that we've been advocating, in fact, even after 9/11, one of the things we said, this is a wake-up call. It's a reminder. How many of you know your neighbors? How many of you, have talked to other parents at your kids' schools or your teachers? And so I think that's a big part of it. There is also in the Sikh tradition, sort of in the 500 years, there's a little bit of a history of, the way I see it personally, Sikhism was always as much a religion as it was a movement for social justice. And so for the way I see it is, it's not just my role to go and do it for myself. To me, it's a broader purpose, that to me, this is the purpose. What is my role in the community at large? I think that's the question that I feel that I'd like to ask, and I ask myself. And so I think one of the things we in the Sikh community, many of us have recognized that we need to engage in the broader community. We need to engage with law enforcement. We need to kind of, so for example, a big issue has been that there's often a reaction if somebody says you're a Muslim or treats you badly. One reaction is to say, no, but I'm not a Muslim. It's almost like saying, not me, the other guy, kind of, And I'm very proud of my community members, many of whom, since 9/11, we have actually partnered with the Arab and Muslim communities. And even for here, for example, almost like a few months after 9/11, we have been working together with our Arab and Muslim brothers and sisters to, for example, do training and education, both with law enforcement, but also in other forums. So I think that that's one of the kind of, I guess personally for me, that's been a compelling reason to kind of engage, to try and educate, and also kind of, I think there's a broader social purpose, I feel.
Such a, I think, moving message. Yeah. There have been 3,000 signups for screenings of this film, and I've been able to attend a tiny fraction of them. And one of them I remember so well, I'll never forget this moment. We were at a very large mosque in Chicago, the Morton Grove Education Center, and it was a mixture. It was an interfaith group of people, and there were many Sikhs, but obviously many Muslims. And a man got up afterwards and he said, I just want to say that I feel like those 6 people took a bullet for me. And it was this acknowledgement and sort of understanding of, this incredible ignorance about the faiths and about this connection that's happening at this moment. And it was really incredibly moving, and for everyone in the audience. I think the difficulty in these times and in these moments, Pardeep, can you talk a little bit about your decision? You said we knew that our dad died for a reason, and that we had to take advantage of this moment. But when something like this happens, something this drastic, there's I think in it a sort of tendency to go internal, and yet the Sikh community in Oak Creek is one of the reasons that you have this incredible community response. And can you talk a little bit about, I don't think we should be Pollyanna here, What were the difficulties, and how hard was that? What were you facing, and what do you think